Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. So my job today is to share a lot of information with you. In particular, the science, the business case, and then some bit about practices around mindfulness and wisdom in the workplace. But before I do that, I actually want to share a personal reflection. So as some of you have heard, I recently left Google to pursue this dream of mine. And I think it's a really interesting story about how that all came about. And so that's what I wanted to share with you, which happened actually. And the reason I want to share this, by the way, was because I feel like it pulls together a lot of the things we were hearing this morning. And so we heard a little bit about how mindfulness leads to insight and wisdom and compassion and hopefully aligned action, right? So the story goes like this, that this winter I was actually at a meditation retreat with John Kabat-Zinn and his son Will Kabat-Zinn, who are co-leading it. It was organized by Soren and Michelle Stransky and our friends here at Wisdom 2.0. Really small retreat, focused for technology leaders. And it was in the Redwoods in Northern California. It was beautiful. And John asked us to really get clear about our intentions for being there. And he walked us through this meditation where we sat with our intention. And what became pretty clear to me was that I wanted to see with clarity and discernment how I might be of service for the greater good. So that's kind of what was clear for me, but I didn't know what that would mean for me. And what became incredibly clear to me by the end of the retreat in sitting with this was that I had this call to start this new company called Wisdom Labs that really works on scaling wisdom, compassion, well-being, content in the world. So stay tuned for that because it's only been about 2 or 3 months since I've left Google and we're building that. But interestingly, same week, my now business partner called me up. I came back from the retreat the next day. My friend Corey Smith, who's sitting right there, called me up and he said, hey, we should talk. It seems like there's big crossroads happening everywhere and with me personally, and I'd love to hear where you're at. And we decided to do this thing. So it's interesting how these practices can often lead to insight, wisdom, right? Compassion as an aspiration, and hopefully a practice that leads to aligned action. So we heard a lot about that this morning. Oh, by the way, the first event that we're doing at Wisdom Labs, just to bring it back to the discussion and to the question as to whether or not leaders need to engage in this, I think the answer is everybody needs to engage in this. And unequivocally, our leaders need to engage in this. And just to let you know, our first event out of the gate as Wisdom Labs is organizing and hosting a small CEO circle. And I promise not to say who's going to be there, but they're the names of people who lead companies of products which you use every day. So 20 of them together with Thich Nhat Hanh. For 3 hours of meditation and reflection on really what is the ethical foundation for the organizations we create, the products we build, and the vision we have for technology for the future. So I wrote a letter to Thich Nhat Hanh, to Thai, saying, please come and help us reflect on this, and then sent him the list of people that could come, and he said yes. So in 1 month's time, this will be happening in San Francisco. Okay, so the business case, science, and practice. How many of you would say that in your lives, the demands and complexity have been increasing over the last several years? Okay, that's almost everybody. How many of you would say that those demands and the complexity are going to continue to increase? That's just about everybody. And how many of you would say that your capacity to meet those rising demands will also rise at the same rate? And that's almost nobody. Okay, and herein lies part of the problem, is that the things that we are creating, the technology that we're creating, right, in some ways increases the complexity of the lives we're leading. And they're created at a machine scale, right? Because it's tech, right? It's not people. But people's capacities are limited to some extent. It's not a surprise. This is not new. We know, for example, that with the law of accelerating returns, computing power has increased twofold every 2 years, right? Ever since pretty much the modern era when the integrated circuit was developed. But pre-industrial and early industrial, we knew that it was linear progression. But now we're into, as this graph shows, exponential progression. again, Moore's law, the speed at which our devices can execute commands and the number of complex circuits in our devices is just going up and to the right. So it's no wonder that we're glutted with information. In fact, to take it to a practical level, it looks something like this, right? Remember that thing there on the left? I thought that was so cool. I thought there was so much computing and, graphics available on that thing. And then came the next thing, and then came this wearable thing, right? And now, in fairness, these are beautifully designed, right, to help us curate the information that they're capable of serving up to us. But in some ways, again, the information and the complexity increases, and we've invented these devices to help manage it. So I'm just setting the context here, right, for the business case, and that's why I'm showing this. And as a result, our inboxes and the way we work make the world very complex, and the world is already turbulent as it is. And it's really hard for our organizations and us who work in the organizations to become resilient at the same rate, right? Similar to that test I just did with you. How many of you think your capacity to meet the rising complexity is going to rise with the complexity at the same rate? A lot of people, U.S. Army War College calls this a VUCA world. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? There's actually a term they coined as they were thinking about guerrilla warfare in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think it pertains in some ways to our real lives. Another way to think about it is we have more wicked problems we're dealing with than ever before. Wicked problems, right? Not a new concept, but as you see here, a simple problem is the problem and a solution are known. You have a toothache, you had a cavity, get it taken care of, right? Complex problem. Self-driving car. Wouldn't it be cool if a car could drive itself? Oh, wow. How do we do that? So we start to find out how, and we solve a complex problem. Wicked problem? Things like climate change, right? Hurricane Sandy. What caused that precisely, exactly, and how do you solve for it? These are the types of problems we're going to increasingly confront, and our leaders need to be more complex and adaptive in their thinking. They need to be agile, adaptable, boundary spanning, collaborative. They need to be self-aware, right? Again, I'm setting here the context for why mindfulness and wisdom, insight and compassion, why all of these things are such useful assets for our leaders and for us personally. And again, you heard a lot of this morning, but what I would like to do is actually put some numbers to it, because I think that would be helpful. And then I would like to talk about the neuroscience behind it, because I think that would be helpful too. So given the complexity, this VUCA world, this glut of information, how are we doing? Let's look at some data. So anecdotally, McKinsey Quarterly, always-on multitasking work environments are killing productivity, dampening creativity, and making us unhappy. Very well stated. What does it look like? So this thing that, going to work is one of the second most, or if not the most, hateful experiences. So Gallup, in their recent survey, and Gallup surveys over the probably 15, 20 years they've been doing this, 25 million people, right? The latest one really generates out of a database of about 1.4 million employees. 70% they're finding of the workforce is not engaged. They have no emotional connection or investment to the work that they do. And 30% are engaged. Now, that might not be true for a place like Google. And I, like I said, until recently I was here, people are pretty motivated. Okay, so it depends. It depends. But if you take an aggregate, all the companies, organizations, people are largely not engaged. Not only that, their well-being is suffering. 8% strongly agree that they experience overall well-being because of their work. 8%. Yeah, right. Wow. It's shocking. How about those people who are engaged? Are they also experiencing well-being together at the same time? Are they engaged and thriving? Only 22% of them are. And when you're engaged and thriving, and by thriving they mean you're experiencing well-being in multiple domains of life, then you're able to bring forth your best work. But only 22% of people, actually, of the millions surveyed, actually said that. Pretty sobering, right? What else? Here's another thing. Take it away from the individual and look at the organization. The majority of people worldwide would not care if most companies disappeared. 73% of people would not care if most brands disappeared. Really interesting survey here from Havas Media. I would suggest you check it out. 134,000 consumers, 700 brands, 23 countries. And they created the Meaningful Brand Index, it's called. It's a measure of personal and collective well-being. And this is one of the questions they asked. Well, what about brands that actually do good in the world and benefit people? Companies. People feel like only 39% of companies actually improve the quality of their lives or their well-being. We can do better, I think. I think we could do better, right? And in some ways, if we're not making the planet better, we're diminishing it. Did you have to think about that one? Hopefully not. All right, great. So what, Rich? Thanks. Great statistics, great survey, whatever. So what? Why should we care about this? A couple of reasons. And this is not comprehensive. This is just to give you a taste, again, of the business case, and then we'll talk about the science. 40% of our working lives will be spent at work, especially if we take between 2 and 3 weeks of vacation, right? And you work from the age of, say, 18 or 21 until 65. 40% of your waking time will be spent at work, just on the personal dimension. That's about 90,000 hours. And you'll spend most of your productive time, energy, and attention working. Right? So, what does that mean in terms of performance as well, right? And especially if you're engaged versus disengaged. If you're sleepwalking, right, because you're not really aligned and you're not really experiencing the best of yourself in your work. So Gallup does a really interesting engagement survey. Like I said, they survey millions of people. And they did a meta-analysis of their various surveys over the years. 263 research studies, 34 countries, 1.4 million employees. And they wanted to see, in terms of engagement, when people felt emotionally invested and committed to their work, what the outcomes would be in terms of these variables: customer ratings, profitability, productivity, turnover, safety. A lot of the metrics that companies actually care about. And here's what they found. I don't know if you could read that very well. But what they found was that between the top and the bottom quartiles of employees that were engaged, they found that absenteeism was 37% less for the ones that were highly engaged, the top quarter of them, quartile. Turnover was 25% less for high turnover companies and 65% less for low turnover companies. Shrinkage, which is waste, was 28% less for high engagement employees. Safety incidents, 48%. You could see this: patient safety, quality, both at 41% greater for the top quartile than the bottom quartile. And then customer satisfaction, productivity, and profitability were all significantly higher for top quartile, highly engaged workforce, right? I'm not going to take questions now, and you could see me later, because this is a lot of information I know. So ask me about those later. Different study of engagement was the Corporate Leadership Council, also a very robust database. I think it's also a 6-figure sample set, multiple countries. Employees who report high levels of engagement, 20 percentile points better in terms of their performance on the indicators that mattered, 57% more productive, 87% less likely to leave. The happiness index, if you drill down on one dimension, right? Lubiomorski and Diener did a great study on this, found that happy people, which one index of well-being, are 3 times more creative, 31% more productive, and they have higher sales, 37% for those who sell things. Well, what does that look like in terms of business results? Great, so that's about the employee. How does that translate to business results? So high engagement companies that report a high level of engagement relative to their peers outperform over a 3-year period the S&P 500. They have at least close to twice the revenue growth compared, to their industry counterparts. And then if you look at what's called the Great Places to Work, right? So this is a survey of what kind of workplace environment people are working in and how they feel about it, run by the Great Places to Work Institute. and they've been running this now for, I think, close to 2 decades. If you look at that, places that in the Fortune 100, the 100 best places to work, look at the way they perform compared to the S&P and the Russell 3000. Right? And that's if you reset it annually, like if, every company, every year you refresh which ones are in there, you see that performance at 11.06. But if you just for the last 20 years, pick the ones that were elected in the great places to work and you just held those, so it's several hundred, they still outperform, right? So this translates into business results is my point. Still, so what, right? So measurement without targeted action is useless. Right? We like the business metrics. That's really useful. Wow, it translates into business results. But how do we actually move the needle on stuff like that? And that's where I want to get into the science a little bit. And in particular, I want to focus on something I like to call vertical development. Vertical development. So traditionally, when we think about the learning process and how people develop and how people, for example, become engaged and inspired and how they get to be their best selves, in the field of learning and development, where I've spent the better part of the last 2 decades, we think of horizontal development. We think of helping bolster people's competencies. We like to think about the behaviors that they'll perform. Help them with better strategic thinking. Help them with faster and better decision making. Right? Help them with X, Y, or Z that are actual just behaviors. What underlies those behaviors? What happens if you take that pivot and you turn it into questions, for example, of values and characters, questions of intention, mindfulness, and compassion, right? You actually can do both, right? Because the core skills that people need have to have beneath them a core set of values and motivations. And if you work at that level, and when you do vertical development, you essentially are filling them up with different behaviors that you're hoping that they will perform. When you do vertical development, you actually expand the capacity of the container. I'm not going to let it run over. But you expand the capacity. Instead of pouring more horizontally into their learning, into their minds, you help create a different kind of container. A container, a mind, a person who is more resilient, who is able to see with greater clarity and discernment, who is able to handle the VUCA world that's ever increasing, right? And so for me, the answer around vertical development is really the only way we can develop people to be highly engaged and support them in being highly engaged and to be their best selves. How do you do that? It's counterintuitive. And this is now where we'll get into the mindfulness piece. But it starts with training your attention. Training your attention. Where are you investing your attention? And mindfulness, like a lot have said before, is about cultivating a mindset, perhaps, or a way of being, a quality of being that's calm, that has great clarity, that allows people to access well-being on demand. I thought Janet's 4 categories were really great: focus, creativity, the ability to connect. So mindfulness is the key science and the key practice around that, and I'll explain that in a minute. But just to illustrate, this is actually a picture of my son when he was 5 years old. And we were hiking a hot, dusty trail in the summer in the mountains of Santa Cruz. And he walked up to me, and I knew, he gave me one of those faces like, I'm grumpy, Dad, kind of faces. He just looked at me. And he just looked at me and he said, okay, Dad, look, I'm really hot, and I am feeling grumpy, and I just need to sit here and meditate, okay? I said, okay, so, I meditate every day. I never taught him. He sometimes walks in on me in the morning, because I get up really early and I'm sitting there, and he sometimes sees me doing it. But I never gave him any instruction. And he just sort of intuitively at the age of 5, he was feeling hot and bothered, and he decided, okay, this is what I need to do. And then that's what he did. And he dropped in, as you can see. Okay, so mindfulness, but what is the science behind it? How do we know that this stuff actually transforms us in the way that I described, transforms the container that is our minds and our thoughts and what we believe ourselves to be, our conceptual self? How does it transform? let's talk about the science. So the mechanism is neuroplasticity, if we just take it from a scientific basis. The mechanism is neuroplasticity, meaning that what we think, do, and pay attention to changes the structure and function of our brain. And that's not just anecdotal. Many, many studies have been done on this now. And in particular, I wanted to share this one with you, which was about the knowledge. Is anyone familiar with the knowledge? Yeah, what is it?
It's the knowledge that London taxi drivers have of everything they get from any condition.
Exactly. The knowledge that London cabbies have to get anywhere in London, any street, in any condition. And there's 25,000 streets. They're not arrayed on a grid. And anyone hazard to guess how long it takes to pass this thing and how many tries? 7 a year. So the answer is it takes 4 years typically and 12 tries because they have to navigate at random. So a bunch of neuroscientists thought this would be interesting. Let's do a study of their brains. And in particular, let's look at those regions of the brain that are concerned with visuospatial reasoning. Okay, the hippocampi. And let's see if there's any difference between them, a randomized control group, and also a group of London bus drivers who drive the same route every day for years at a time. And what did they find? Sure enough, to a very significant degree, the hippocampi of these London cabbies was significantly enlarged. It had grown. It had developed like a muscle would develop because they had to hold and navigate this sum total of London streets. So studies like that and study after study after study show that our brains are actually plastic. They change depending on the structure and the structure and functions of our brains change depending on what we do. And I love this metaphor, which is a sort of like cutting grooves, right? Your thoughts, your actions, even the feelings that you hover your mouse of attention on cut grooves in your brain. That's not actually accurately what happens. It's more like neurons firing in a certain pathway that becomes like a groove, just like water in a canyon. So being mindful about what we are paying attention to and the activities we're engaging in is critical. Great. Well, why is it so important? Well, we think about our functional neuroanatomy and how we can use mindfulness to be more masters of our own experience at work, our feelings and our thoughts. Because here's another interesting thing. The primitive part of our brain, the limbic system, and particularly the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, was the earliest evolved, one of the earliest evolved parts of our brain responsible for feelings. It's the feeling center of the brain, amongst other things. Feelings, emotions, were there to allow us to survive when we were out on the savannah. So if we heard a twig snap, we had an emotion, and usually there are 4 key survival emotions. We call them the 4 Fs. They're still very, very present with us today. 4 Fs, right? Fight, flight, feed, and reproduce. Right? So they still help us navigate the world today, and they're very powerful, right? However, they're not just in response to real threats, they're also in response to perceived threats. So the amygdala fires powerfully, and a lot of you will know this, it fires powerfully when you have a perceived threat. How many of you, for example, have gotten pissed off at an email? That's, again, the majority of, it's an email. It's words on a computer with someone having some idea about something that pissed you off. It's not a saber-toothed tiger. But these things have such a powerful impact on us that then we react, right? Turns out we have this other part of the brain, luckily, the prefrontal cortex, that down-regulates the amygdala. It's the executive center of our brain, right? And so if we can harness that and have the two play together complementarily, then we can have a better way of working. And it turns out that mindfulness is critical in bringing a lot of those capabilities from the executive center, from the prefrontal cortex, into play to help regulate the other parts of our brain, to help foster things like emotional intelligence, for example, and ultimately engagement and well-being. So, great. Scientifically, what does that look like? So they found in functional magnetic resonance imaging that increasing mindfulness activities that helped people name their emotions, becoming insight and becoming aware of the emotions they're experiencing, actually decreased emotional reactivity in the amygdala. Similarly, a structured mindfulness practice, in this case MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, helped increase the activity in the prefrontal cortex, the right and the ventral in the medial, and then also decreased emotional reactivity. So similar outcomes, right, in this study, and again, these are replicated over and over again. They also found that the actual cortex, the gray matter in it, actually expanded after 8 weeks of this particular course, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So your cortical thickness actually increases. And the brain waves that are happening, perhaps even now, as you're looking at this and hearing what I'm saying and analyzing information, you're probably operating at beta, high frequency, high modulation. When you drop in to meditative states, for example, contemplative states, you actually drop into a different frequency and modulation called alpha and theta, right? And that's where a lot of creativity and insight happens. Because think about like the last time you had a great idea, it wasn't under duress, I would imagine, right? And a lot of you, if I asked you, would probably say shower or walking the dog, you know, just sitting around or meditating or some such. It's because we drop into alpha and theta. These are optimal states. And also there's phase synchrony between the different electromagnetic patterns in our brain. And so that allows us to bring online different parts of the brain. In this study, for example, these are gamma wave. So that's phase synchrony within the brain. Happening during meditation practice, by the way. So it's a study of contemplative practices and their effects on brainwave modulation. But can you really change levels of happiness? Some people say, you know, Lyubia Morsky had a really interesting study, and she talks about the fact that about 40% of happiness, which is, again, a slice of well-being, can change, and 10% depends on circumstances, and 50% depends on our set point, right? But here's, what? Set point is just our biology. So here's the other thing, though. As they continued their most recent study, they did this meta-analysis, 300,000 people, they found that happy individuals are successful across multiple domains of life, and that happiness preceded success. Happiness preceded success. Right? We often tend to think the opposite way around. Okay, so, and the last thing is that it's not just our functional neuroplasticity that happens, it's also pure perception. Whatever we call perception really makes a difference. And this is a really interesting study where 30,000 adults were followed for 8 years, and then their death records were followed of who died. And in particular, they surveyed them over these 8 years and asked them, in the last year, have you experienced, what level of stress have you experienced? And then they also asked them, and is stress good or bad on a scale, right? So here's what they found. Well, if you experienced a lot of stress and you think stress is bad, you had a 43% higher chance of dying, right? If you experienced stress but thought it was a good thing, you even had a lower chance of dying than people who reported no stress. So one key thing to keep in mind, and we have known this for 100 years, right? This curve is 100 years old. Actually, Yerkes-Dodson curve on optimal stress, right? There is an optimal point of stress that motivates us. Okay, so anyway, so the reason I like to show all of this in terms of mindfulness practice is because when we think of that as an evidence base, we think about the benefits that obtain from things like mindfulness practice, which I've listed here, and you've heard today, and you might know. And then finally, what are these skills and what do they look like? So I like to say that it's attention training, it's visualization, and it's the ability to do an internal scan, which brings online things like emotional intelligence, engagement, greater well-being, etc. And I'm at about the end of my time, so I think I would just leave you with this thought. Sorry about the scroll through, but how about this thought? Happiness is the new productivity. Maybe. Wait, I'm not done. Could it be meaning-making, which leads to happiness, is the new productivity? Could it be that mindfulness is the practice that allows us to make meaning and experience happiness and be more productive? And one last thing. Let's not call it productivity. Let's just say we're going to change the game. Thank you.